hopefully we're going to keep us moving along. About a 15 minutes to talk about GDPR, right? What do you think? Can we do it?
Yeah.
Sure. Perfect. So welcome. Seat. So, what the heck is no? So the General Data Protection Regulation.
Regulation, yeah.
So GDPR, of course, just by quick show of hands, how many people have had freakouts over the past year about GDPR? Yeah, pretty good portion of the room. What I thought we would do is talk a little bit about GDPR as it relates to our day-to-day lives in North America. And let's see if we can dive into a couple topics that could give people in the audience some good takeaways to figure out what does it mean to us and how will it affect us here, okay? So as a starting point, one of the things that I think would be beneficial to talk a little bit about is, let's start with you, Marinda. Do you believe that there are going to be cases, or are there already cases where the EU is going after companies and/or individuals in the US or abroad anywhere? Are there cases where there is true, real threat of prosecution for?
Well, there are a few. In fact, Google was one of the first. The French authorities levied a $57 million fine against Google for improperly or not sufficiently disclosing their data collection use for targeted directed marketing. There's another interesting case in Portugal where the Portuguese authority fined a hospital 400 million euros. And what was interesting about that is it was an external data breach. It was an internal data breach where about 1,000 staffers had access to patient records, where they only had like 300 doctors on staff. And so they were fined against that. So I raised that point because it illustrates that we don't necessarily know how the regulation is going to be enforced. And so that's significant. I think one of the questions that's often asked is, at least now that it's there, because regulation has been slow to start, and I think it's primarily because the regulators really weren't prepared. There's been a number of reports and high volume of reports. But the question now is kind of, is it going to be proactively preventative, or is it going to be punitive, like reactively punitive? So that's kind of the question that's out there right now as to what's it going to look like, what's the landscape going to be in the future from the regulators' standpoint.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So just to give everyone a bit of an idea of what's happened since May 25th when GDPR went into effect, within the first 5 or so months, there was over 42,000 reports of notifications. And it's not just people who are doing this. So there's NGOs who are out there. There's a few very, very prominent ones in the EU who are aggressively going after what they see as egregious breaches of data security. So what Marinda talked about there with Google's ad targeting, these are not necessarily one-time infractions. These are ongoing ways that companies across the planet have been taking data and using it for various purposes. It does have some parallels to real estate in lead information and things like that, as well as homes information and solids and all that kind of stuff. But just to put a bit of context to it as well, the Google thing that they got fined 50 million euros for was reported on June 1st, so within a week of GDPR going into effect. It was announced on January 24th or 21st, in the last week or so. And that's a big one, right? So you can tell the French authorities at CCPA were like looking at it and going, okay, well, we've got to put a lot of our effort onto this, but it's just starting. We don't really know the effects internationally. Google is just probably the largest fish, so they targeted that first, but there's bound to be more happening.
So I know we're talking about GDPR, but maybe we could bring it down to a North American level for a minute and just think about there's been a lot of talk about modifications potentially to GDPR because it's, number one, extraordinarily confusing, number two, very difficult to actually implement some of the things that they're shooting for. But regardless of that, it seems to have created a bit of a movement, right? And has that movement, we started to see other changes so I know Canada has some interesting rules and regulations that are evolving and morphing. I think California has some new rules and regulations that they're toying with, and who knows, there may be some specifics that come out for the United States in general that are closer to what GDPR is going for. What are your opinions on, are you seeing movement on those fronts about moving closer to the direction of what's going on in the EU right here in our backyard, and are there things that we should be, I shouldn't say concerned with, but prepared for?
I think there's definitely a trend. The United States, we're governed by a patchwork of privacy regulations, and there's virtually every state has a data breach notification law. So that's kind of the immediate concern. There's been a lot of talk about, the federal government coming up with some whole regulation that governs it all, but that's not necessarily anywhere in the near future. The California Consumer Privacy Act is probably going to have a large impact, given one, that California is the 5th largest economy in the world. It's going to have a broadest effect, and they often are leaders in this kind of thing, and other states will follow suit. The problem with privacy is it's defined differently. So from your perspective, it's understanding what markets you're in and what laws govern the conduct that you're doing. So I think there's definitely a trend, and it's not just North America, it is really global. Canada just reviewed their Privacy Act, and they came up with a new data breach notification that's very similar to the GDPR, and sometimes it's very ambiguous, so that's the difficulty. What is the actual requirement? So staying ahead of it and understanding what those regulations are demanding, and trying to prepare as best you can.
And Scott, how are you seeing this affect, this must, in a practical way, right, it's got to affect the products that you build as well.
For sure, and when you look at the GDPR's impact on us over here, it was really designed to be a motivator for other countries to do this because of some of the very far-reaching kind of impacts that it has, with penalties and such. So CCPA is something you need to look at. It's we'll say it again, the California Consumer Protection Act of 2018. CCPA, write that down, because you're going to hear a lot about it. It's enforceable in any state that does trade with California residents. And moreover than anything, the takeaways that you guys really need to start thinking about are kind of the core tenets of it, as well as CASL, which is the Canadian Anti-Spam Law, GDPR. They're all kind of got these core threads. That's disclosure, telling people the data that you're taking from them or using with their consent. So a lot of this requires explicit consent as opposed to opt-out consent or implicit consent. Deletion, so being able to delete people's information and giving them access to that as well. So not just telling them what you're taking, but showing them what you have with it. And then be able to opt out of anything you've got as well. CCPA is interesting because they do have, a lot of it revolves around the selling of information, which is roughly defined as moving information around if it has value, which is pretty much most lead data. So there's quite a bit of stuff in there that pretty much everyone in this room should be looking at. It goes into effect January 1st, 2020, even though it was passed last year. And enforcement goes into effect July of 2020. So,
just to expand on one point with that, as far as applicability, there's 3 categories of applicability. One of the biggest one is if you're collecting information on 50,000 individuals, devices, or households. So that's very, very sweeping. And so I think a lot of companies will probably find that the applicability falls in that category rather than the 24 million in it, if all you're doing is buying or selling data.
There's one more part to it, and that's the stick, right? So GDPR came out scaring a lot of people because it was like up to 20 million euros fines for a breach, or 4% of global turnover, which is a lot, unless you're not doing a lot of global turnover. But CCPA is a little bit different in that it has like actual damages and there's some statutory kind of damages that are in there too. But it can add up. And one thing that, and Marinda can talk, she's a lawyer, I'm not, but there's some absolute opportunity out there for class action, because it doesn't have to just come from the state AG. Anyone can bring suit over this stuff when it goes into effect after July 1st next year. So Marinda can probably talk about that, or you can talk to your lawyer.
So, just bringing this down to the practical level, right? You mentioned some of the things that people we're going to need to know about, and understand, and appreciate. As anyone in this audience is designing products or trying to take existing products and bring them into this new century of these requirements related to not just privacy, but control for the consumer. What are the things that we should all be thinking about from a design perspective? What are those things that we should, and I don't just mean UI, UX, product design, but even policy designs and those sorts of things, right? Daryl was talking about some all-encompassing things related to how Google deals with privacy, right? Google's not the only one that needs to be concerned about that. That's something that everybody in this room, if you're building products, these are the things that we need to all be concerned about. So just in the last few minutes here, what are some of those practical things we could think about from a product perspective, as well as from a policies and procedures perspective in our businesses, that we could apply to help get us prepared for 2020 and things that we need to, right? We can't wait until January. We need to start working on these things now to put them in place. So Scott, in your estimation, what are those things?
Sure. Well, one of the big things from GDPR, and one of the tenets of it, the main tenets and the first tenet they always talk about is privacy by design. So it's incorporated this privacy as a core part of the way you think about building a product, not as kind of a thing you slap on after the fact once you freak out about it all that you didn't know about before it went into place. So that being said, you obviously got to figure out what works for you and your product, but I mean, it's going to be the law, and GDPR is fun to think about being over in the EU, they're never going to prosecute us over here, haha, that's fine, isn't that nice? It's starting to get real over here, guys. So looking at not just a product standpoint, but also a marketing and business standpoint, privacy as a competitive advantage, and being able to show your customers that, yeah, you take this seriously, yes, you've got their back, and you're protecting them, is going to be probably the biggest opportunity that's out there, well beyond just the threat of some kind of litigation or whatever.
I really liked what you had to say. I just want to pause really quick on that point, and we've got less than 2 minutes, but think about what Scott just said is treating this as an opportunity, right? Not a stick. Yes, there's a stick, but the opportunity to differentiate yourself in this market. What can you do to put the consumer in greater control and make them feel like you have their back? That seems to be a huge takeaway.
Absolutely, and I think just being prepared. So in order to understand what regulations actually apply, you kind of have to know what data you have. So we call it data mapping. So you figure out what kind of data you're collecting, how are you storing it, how are you using it, and then you can decide what policies and procedures you need to have in place, and you can understand what rules and regulations apply. So from a practical standpoint, that's kind of the place to start in preparing and getting ahead of those regulations as they come out. The other thing to remember is that the rules are really designed to protect the consumer, not necessarily the data, although the data security is absolutely relevant. But keep that in mind. The idea is to protect the consumer. So if you're designing these things, what risk is that putting at the consumer, and what are the regulators going to look at? And that comes down to control and those kind of things. Because to be fair, we're in a belief economy, right? Which means the consumer is the arbiter of business success. So if they're demanding these things, then, as you said, find it as an opportunity, take it as an opportunity, and the consumers will follow.
That's a great point. And so if you haven't gone through an exercise like this data mapping exercise, right, understand what you're capturing, understand how it's being used, understand even where it's being stored. In some cases, we need to know. understand where it's traveling to, right? Those are the things that you need to be prepared for, because if you don't have that visibility, you're going to have a very difficult time figuring out what do you need to do.
And where it's traveling from, because you don't necessarily know who is providing that data unless you know, they could be providing it from anywhere in the world.
Awesome. Well, we have successfully accomplished this in 15 minutes. Next up is going to be Lucy to introduce the next panel. Thank you so much, Scott.